Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. So, just to explain, when I will take you through this, I will be highlighting some peer-reviewed academic publications throughout. But of course, I do know that these are often very inaccessible because they tend to be very expensive to access. So, at the end, I have a few more accessible or free sources that I would recommend um, for teaching. Um, so we're talking today about why people went on crusade, and I thought that I would start by giving you all a little bit of context. So when we're talking about the crusading movement, we are talking about a series of wars designated by the papacy of Rome as crusades, because in order for it to be a crusade, it has to be called as such by the papacy, initially based in the Mediterranean and aimed at the Holy Land, so modern day Palestine and Israel, but also later we have crusades called most famously and for a very long time in the Baltic Sea, also in France itself against the Albigensian heresy. But in order to be a crusade, it has to be called by the Holy War, by the Holy See. And the Crusades we're talking about today are sort of the earliest part of the Crusader movement between the First Crusade and the so called Fourth Crusade in 1204, which is where we see crusading really starts evolving beyond its original definition. And it is very important to keep in mind at this point that crusade is a much later word, that at the time they were literally called Iter Jerusalemitanorum, a journey or pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So we are at the end of the 11th century, and it is important to keep in mind that at this point, the Byzantine Empire, which is the culturally Greek empire, which is the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire, has been under attack for a very long time, and it has progressively lost territory. It has progressively lost territory it used to rule over the entire Middle East. This was conquered by the expanding caliphates at the beginning of the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And at this point, it is also under attack from the Seljuk Turks, which are these peoples who are also Muslim, and they are coming in and progressively taking more and more parts of the Byzantine Empire's territory. And the empire is not doing particularly well. They have been attempting to get back, as you can see on this map, parts of their empire, but they're really struggling to do so. And it is important at this point to say that Jerusalem itself has been held by Muslim rulers since the 9th century. So this is not a new situation, which is important to keep in mind as we talk about the Crusade. And essentially, very recently, so in the 40 years before the beginning of the First Crusade, there has been the East-West schism in Christianity, which is at the origin of the schism, of the separation between Orthodox Christianity and first Catholic, then Catholic and Protestant Christian confessions later. Why is all this important? Because at the time in which the Pope calls for this unprecedented expedition, he does so with the knowledge, the agreement, and different scholars overstress how significant this is, but explicitly after a call by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios and in support of the Byzantine Empire. But this crusade is pitched specifically, which again is not called crusade, it is called a journey to Jerusalem, a journey in arms, is called specifically to free, as the different versions of the call to crusade agree on, to free, so-called free, the holy places and the route to pilgrimage to the holy places. So we have the figurehead of Western Christianity in agreement with the emperor of Eastern Christianity, and this Eastern Christian empire has been progressively losing territory. And there is this expedition, which is both couched in a very contextualized, in a very specific political, but also religious landscape. And it is important to keep in mind that Eastern and Western Christians don't necessarily see each other as being very similar a lot of the time. So this is incredibly complex, and I sort of really took a second to go into this because it is important to realize that it is very complicated what is happening on the eve of the First Crusade. And then when we talk about the reasons why people are going on crusade, we have to keep all this in mind. Now, this is the 11th century, so unfortunately, so at the time, information is scarce. Very few people who went on crusade would have been aware of everything that was going on at the time. But this was what did underpin it, and some people were, in fact, very, very, very au courant with this, as we'll see in a second. So it is really important to say that when we are talking about the Crusades, and this is especially important in the era of the internet, but it builds on several hundred years of this happening, we are working on something that has been the catalyst for a lot of extremely political and extremely dangerous and extremely damaging appropriation, especially in the last 20 years. Very famously, George W. Bush referred to the war on terror as a crusade. We are working in a moment in which the Crusades are looked at as the blueprint of the so-called clash of civilization. And this is something that scholars, I gave you an example here, have been working on a really long time. In particular, Jason T. Roche, who has edited this issue, has also worked on the way that, for example, ISIS has used the idea of crusading for their own propaganda. So this is a very, very widespread idea, and I will return over and over in this presentation to how it's actually really important to keep in mind this context when we are talking about the Crusades, because very often what we're looking at is not just the sources of the Crusader era, which are plentiful, but for the Middle Ages, we still don't have everything or as much as we would like, but we are also looking at something that sits in a specific context and gets manipulated and presented and claimed for this context. And a really big part of talking about the Crusades is that the Crusades are often presented in popular culture in different contexts as being the evolution of a centuries-long struggle between Christians and Muslims. And this, as far as we can make out, is absolutely not what happens, and it is not perceived in this way. As I was mentioning with the Byzantine Empire, yes, at the beginning of Islam, there is a big expansionistic territorial push within the new Muslim caliphate, but this is not presented as a holy war as far as we can see, given the scarcity of sources for early Islam. They expand in territories which have been historically majority Christians, which often remain majority Christians, or that are in fact very, very cultural. And here I sort of used two examples of what usually gets cited as a precedent for the crusading movement. The case of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is taken over by various entities ruled by Muslim rulers, and then there is a big nationalist myth in the formation of the modern state of Spain of the so-called Reconquista. So the idea that for centuries, the Christians of Spain fought against the Muslims to take back Spain. And this is, of course, very historical. There is there is a very, very long time, there is longer that is spent between the beginning of the so-called Reconquista and its end nearly 5 centuries later than there is in the Muslim conquest. I mean, what are you reconquering, in Granada, which has been several hundred years under Muslim rule? Nobody remembers that. So, it is very much an artificial construct. And here Garcia San Juan talks about this. But also the example of Sicily. Sicily used, again, to be ruled by the Byzantine Empire. That's why I insisted on the Byzantine Empire. It's the big political entity who's falling apart from all this. And thus it is conquered by North African Muslims, going through different dynasties, Aghlabids and Zirids, and then it is conquered by the Western Christian Normans who have migrated to the south. And sometimes this is also being claimed as a precedent for the Crusade, but actually, as we'll see in a moment, Southern Normans who have been active in Sicily clearly see it as something distinctive and different. So it's very important to say that when we are talking about the Crusades, we are looking at something that is considered actually at the time to be very, very new. We have papal bulls in which the popes had to explicitly say to knights in Iberia, no, do not go to Jerusalem, stay in Spain, because clearly for these people who have been fighting Muslim-ruled entities, that is a completely separate and very new thing. And so, of course, the novelty of the call to crusade, really, we need to keep it in mind when we think about why people might join it. Now, a lot of this sort of focuses on the first crusade because this is where it starts, but we'll move beyond that. And I think the two very important, and this is an oversimplification, but the two big theories of why do people look on crusade is Jonathan Riley Smith's The First Crusaders. And Jonathan Riley Smith really highlighted the way in which people would go on crusade, thinking of it explicitly as a pilgrimage in arms, and how going on crusade was extremely expensive, and how going on crusade could actually be financially ruinous. So it was quite a big undertaking, and there isn't, Jonathan Riley Smith argues, a self-evident material motive. Conversely, Christopher Tyman in God's War argues about the ways in which actually there is a lot of, the word uses sort of well-connected opportunism for a lot of crusaders that go and they are able to actually make substantial financial gains, establish themselves in the Holy Land. Now, of course, here I am very much simplifying and reducing to minimum terms because, of course, scholarship has built on these findings to actually go on and further to a much more complicated, to a very complicated view already from the nuanced arguments of Riley, Smith, and Tyman, but more and more scholarship has been charting the overlap between the basically between spiritual and material gains, and very often highlighting how actually spiritual and material motives can very, very strongly overlap. And the problem here is the problem that in my research I call the problem of the so-called good crusader, that because the crusader movement has been romanticized for so long, especially in the later Middle Ages with models of chivalry, but then in the early modern and modern era, in poetry, in paintings, in opera, then in films. For a very long time, there was this, and still, unfortunately, now there is a model of the chivalrous and heroic crusader knight. And then that makes it very complicated to go back to the evidence. So, for example, here I highlight Simon John's work on Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey of Bouillon was Duke of Lower Lotharingia, and he was the leader of the First Crusade when the army actually got to Jerusalem. And Simon John highlights how actually Godfrey of Bouillon is sort of literally sanctified in later writings about the Crusades. He's talked about as this quintessential spiritual aesthetic leader. Simon John also shows how actually Godfrey had very strong reason to leave Lower Lotharingia, how he did sell his castle and he managed to leave and not return, but that was also because his position at home was becoming untenable, and how actually Godfrey was a very, very shrewd utilizer of motifs of religion in order to gain a following. So this is very complex. There is a strong overlap. Then we look at Raymond de Saint-Gilles, who was a French nobleman, and he's very different from Godfrey. He doesn't have a strong reason to go on crusade. It is demonstrably very financially ruinous. But also Raymond of St. Gilles' army is the source of a lot of very deeply religiously infused crusader writing that really shapes a perspective of the First Crusade as analyzed by Beth Spacey in her work. Personally, I work on the Normans in southern Italy, and I highlight that these are people who have actually been fighting the Byzantine Empire for a very long time. Their own chroniclers at home think that they go on crusade to continue this fight against the Byzantine Empire, because again, the First Crusade, a long time spent in Byzantine land, and nearly a year is spent besieging the city of Antioch. And I was looking, and I look very often in my work at the way in which these people clearly are bringing in completely separate interests, but actually because they're very successful at the business of crusading, they are highlighted and they are held up as examples, crusader models, and they are then written about, especially Tancred, who is particularly young and a striking figure at the time, but also Bohemond is sort of these examples of chivalry. So it's really complicated. Why do people go on crusade? And this gets more complicated with the creation of so-called outremer, which is a French word literally meaning beyond the sea, which is sort of the catch-all word for these political entities, also known as crusader states or crusader polities, which are founded in the Middle East after the First Crusade. And as you can see, this is a very long territory. It's stretched out. It's backed by desert on both sides. It is between very different political entities. Um, Many of them Muslim ruled, also some Greeks. It is very important to point out that at this point, the Muslim world is not united. Below the grim bit of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, you see the Fatimid Caliphate, whose Muslim confession is Shia. The other Muslim ruled entities in this map, they're all Muslim Sunni. So it is actually a very complicated place to hold. And so as outremer goes on, it becomes really hard to keep it, to staff it. And so actually what you see in the Crusader sources is the contrast between people who keep coming from Europe because they want to undertake a pilgrimage in arms, but they also want to go home afterwards. And people who are actually on the ground, and which as time goes on, they are children of Western Europeans. They are culturally, there is a lot of Western European culture, but they are born in outremer. And so, for example, there is a big problem that is sometimes highlighted in the sources between how actually the Kingdom of Jerusalem is very multicultural. You have different religions, you have different strands of the same religion, you have different ethnic groups claiming the same religion, and actually you get people coming from Europe and just wanting to attack whoever they see who is not a Western European Christian, and the locals saying, actually, no, we are allied to them. And we see this actually, these Christian principalities, sometimes they fight each other with their Muslim allies. So the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, very early after the First Crusade, they fight each other with their respective Muslim allies. So actually, when you're looking at what is crusading itself, the motivations of somebody who is actually a baron holding land in this Christianist, and the way that they relate to somebody who is coming from Europe, wanting to be there for about a year and fight when there isn't necessarily a battle going at the time, is actually incredibly complex and complicated, and it doesn't really bear out that model, that romanticized model of the Christian knights just going to fight there. And an important part of the creation and the sustainability of outremer is the foundation of the monastic military orders, which are orders of warrior monks, of which the most famous are the Templars and the Hospitallers, that are literally staffing the kingdom on the ground. So again, we see that these very complex context is not getting any easier. And that really, really has a bearing on why do people go on crusade? What do they find on the ground? Why? And what's really also important is that as we go on, the idea of crusading becomes more and more prestigious because you have kings that go on crusade. Now, the First Crusade is a crusade of barons. Nobody who has a higher title than a duke is going on this crusade. But later, we will have crusading the kings. England, most famously, Richard Lionheart, he goes on crusades. Now, of course, when a king goes on crusade, he's not going to stay in outremer. He is going to have at some point to return home, which is a problem itself. In the so-called Second Crusade, in the 1120s, you get these huge armies led by the King of France, led by the Holy Roman Emperor, but they're not coordinated, and they end up not being very helpful at all in what they are trying to do, because it becomes very, very complicated to coordinate this. Lots of people want to go on crusade, but actually what happens once a contingent is gotten together and is just traveling towards the east is very complex. And when you have a crusading family, especially in France and England, you have these dynasties of people who can boast that their ancestors were at the taking of Jerusalem. They want to return. They want to go there again because that is something that brings prestige to you. And people do write on their graves or on their coins, Hierosolymitanus, literally of Jerusalem. They went to Jerusalem. But meanwhile, again, on the ground, there is an interest in keeping people. So I was highlighting here James Doherty, who writes about these crusading families, and Andrew Bach, who writes about the Principality of Antioch, and the way that the Principality of Antioch, which is a border principality, and so there is a lot of fighting, many princes of Antioch die in battle, they have this problem that they keep having to invite noblemen over in order to literally run Antioch on the ground. And so you wonder, is this crusading? Why are these noblemen going over? They're literally being offered a very complex place to rule, but they are being offered a place to rule. And so again, we have this intersection of a practice of piety and a practice of rule, and how after the First Crusade is complex enough, but you get this accumulation of different motives why somebody would want to go east, why somebody might want to go and explicitly say, this is my pilgrimage in arms, and also return, but somebody might go and also stay. And when you have been explicitly invited and told, come to Outremer, marry the Princess of Antioch, rule Antioch, then that is also quite a complicated reasoning to assess there. Now, this very brief survey ends in 1204, because what happens in 1204? In 1204, we see all these complications that I have been mentioning so far, how distant the kingdom is, how hard it is to get there, how hard it is to coordinate big armies to go there together. It all comes together in the fact that the Crusaders get to Venice to take sheep for the East, because they have discovered over the course of the 12th century that riding to Jerusalem is actually incredibly complicated, it's expensive, it's dangerous, so they want to take ship. The problem is that they have no money, so the Venetians embark them, and then here you get into a game of the Crusaders blame the Venetians blame the Crusaders, because what happens is that they sack two Christian cities, first Zara in the Balkans, and then Constantinople itself. And so the Fourth Crusade has this lot of extremely contradictory narratives in which people blame each other for why did they say they were going, because at this point Jerusalem has fallen again, and this again into the hands of Muslim rulers. It has been conquered famously by the Kurdish ruler Salahuddin in 1189. But instead of going to Jerusalem, they have gone to Constantinople and they have sacked it. And then the fact that because they now establish a Western Christian empire in Constantinople, the Pope first tries to excommunicate them and then he forgives them. So when you get to 1204, actually you see this very powerful idea because it has rallied rulers across Europe. It has created these traditions of families and dynasties of people who have gone on crusades. It has created these very extensive but very hard to keep and defend and to make sustainable entities. And it has continued to play with the really complex interplay on the ground of the Byzantine Empire on the one side, the Seljuk Sultanates on the other, and on the other hand, again, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. And these all comes together in the fact that a crusade that starts to go and, as they would put it, free Jerusalem, actually sacks Constantinople and founds a separate empire there. So here we see that actually after 1204, the idea of crusading will become more and more flexible. It is after this that crusades will be called against heretics in other places, because what 1204 shows is that the idea of crusade is powerful and it can also be unchained from the idea of Jerusalem itself. And so it's this very, at once we see the power of this idea, the uniqueness and the novelty of this idea, but also the very different ends to which it can be put. And so at this point, it becomes, again, trying to establish why somebody going on crusade, and the romanticized and very often appropriated to imperialist or Islamophobic or racist narratives, it becomes, as we can see, just completely separate from what is the reality. Because anytime that the papacy calls a crusade, you have the interplay of several religions, several cultures, immensely complex geopolitical interplays, of which many of the people themselves who take part in the expedition may know separate things. We do have crusaders who make their testaments because they leave for the east and they say, I'm going east to take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I take it in arms, I need to atone for this sin. You have people saying, I am going for the east because my cousin is a baron in Outremer and he has called me and told me they needed good fighting men and I have nothing here. And so I am going. And this is really what we are working with. These immense, one reason why crusade studies is so extensive is because of the many different fields it takes together behind the apparently simple question, why is somebody going on crusade? And so takeaway thoughts, and just to show an example of romanticized 19th century idea of the crusade, we have the depiction of Templars and Hospitallers from a stained glass window. The takeaway thoughts from this, before I move on talking about accessible resources on this topic, is the fact that the Crusades are always an incredibly complex topic to talk about. So simplifications are always to be shied away from. And here myself, in order to fit it into the time, I have simplified some of the things I have talked about. And there is always a very romantic and imperialist filter because, especially after the early modern era, the idea of crusading becomes harnessed to a variety of things. We have crusader poems in early modern Italy, when early modern Italy is fighting for territorial control of the Mediterranean with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. We have crusader narratives in colonial France and imperial Britain, trying to justify this and present it as a new crusader endeavor. And we have an enduring historiographical problem in that, as I have very quickly sketched out, actually there is always a huge historiographical discussion going around this idea of the crusading. So, accessible resources. Accessible resources, these I have divided in two sections. Now, two of these sources are actually free access. All of the others are available between £5 and £15. So first, on medieval appropriations, as I have tried to convey, actually the way in which the medieval is appropriated is very important when we talk about the Crusades, because actually very often when people Google, I see it with my own students, I try to tell them how to Google and they still end up finding very unsavory things. So I think it's really important to talk about this because actually a lot of information about the Crusader movement is currently spread through YouTube videos or through memes. So there is this free article on time.com, which is not specifically about the Crusader movement, but it does talk very specifically about this use of the Middle Ages by the far right. Then there is this very helpful book, Whose Middle Ages Teachable Moments for an Ill-Used Past. Again, this is this is available widely in both a paperback and an ebook version. There is a chapter by Crusade scholar Adam Bishop specifically about the Crusades, but it is very useful if you teach about the Middle Ages because it addresses different things, such as a chapter there are chapters on various ways in which we can see the Middle Ages being used in internet culture. Now, the next book is not as accessible, unfortunately. You might try and get it through a library, but I thought it might be particularly helpful for teaching because this talks about the ways in which the British Empire used Crusader medievalism. So the ways, for example, in which when during the First World War, the British army conquers Jerusalem, all of the British papers talk about it as if it is a new crusade. And so I thought, because I know very often teaching the Middle Ages is a bit complex to link it with the 20th century themes, this would be a really fantastic resource if you can get it to your library. Again, unfortunately, this was published as an academic text book, and so it is much more expensive. On the Crusader movement, now, luckily, a lot of professional Crusade historians have written a lot for a public audience. And so when you start to search for books on the Crusades, there is a lot of very badly done stuff, but there is actually a lot that is done by very serious scholars who have worked on this. And I highlighted Christopher Tyerman. He has written one of the Oxford University Press very short introductions, which are sort of, you might have seen them, these tiny books. They cost a fiver on Kindle, or I think £8 to £10 in paperback. They're very short. They're like 60 pages. And he wrote that. But also his big book, God's War, is actually available as an ebook and from Penguin. So this is actually, I mean, it's a very thick book. I wouldn't personally possibly recommend it for a high school audience, but it is really fantastic. And it gathers together many, many resources, primary sources to look at. The next one, Susanna Throop, The Crusades, an Epitome. So this is now 5 years ago, but Susanna Throop brought together basically a lot of different scholarship and made a summary of the state of the field for the Crusades. And this was published by Kismet, which is an open access imprint, so you can actually access this for free. You can download it, and I highly recommend it. Then the next one is very, very recent, Megan Cassidy Welch, Crusades and Violence. Again, it's a very small book. It's about 100 pages in a tiny format, and it's about, I think, £10 to buy. And it brings together both different scholarships. It can be a really wonderful place to go and check what the state of scholarship is, but also talks about this idea of the Crusades, violence, why do people do violence on Crusade. The next one by Amin Malouf, again, £5, I think, in ebook, 10, 15 in paperback. This is the Crusades to Arab Eyes, and Amin Malouf did this very important thing that they brought together all these different primary sources, because we have some really, really, I didn't touch on it because I was talking about Christian motivations to go on crusade, but we have really, really rich Arabic language scholarship about the Crusades, and they are brought together in this book, which is sort of very readable and can offer a very interesting and important counterpoint to the Eurocentric view of the Crusades. Helen Nicholson, A Brief History of the Knights Templar. Helen Nicholson is the foremost scholar on the monastic orders, and she wrote this very small books, and I think the Knights Templar are very often one of the most fictionalized aspects of the Crusader movement, so it's very useful to look at. And finally, Jonathan Phillips, Holy Warriors, A Modern History of the Crusades. Again, very small, very readable book, written by one of the most foremost scholars of the Crusades. This was something that can be gotten to, and you can take excerpts out of, and can be a good teaching tool. So thank you very much for your attention. I realize I brought you to a huge cavalcade. I mean, so the fascination and the problem we're talking about, the Crusades, but I very much look forward to your questions.